Good morning. I'm extending a warm welcome to our event presented by the League of Women Voters of the United States and co-sponsored by the Global NGO Executive Committee. This moderated panel will explore global trends in voter decline and responses in different regions. The panelists will provide insights on challenges, legal frameworks, electoral reforms, and strategies to strengthen voter participation. I am Dr. Connie Soban-Sensor. I'm the main representative for the League of Women Voters to the United Nations and Vice President of the Global NGO Executive Committee. I will be your moderator today. It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel of experts. Their full bios are in our flyer and on the registration page for this event. I wanted to let you all know that we have over 400 participants registered for this webinar. We're thrilled, and it looks like the representation is from more than 30 countries. We will have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end, but you can certainly type your questions in as they come up, and we'll try to answer as many as we can at the end of the session. Dr. Seema Shah is the head of International IDEA's Democracy Assessment Unit that produces an annual Global State of Democracy report. Selena Stewart is the Chief Executive Officer of the League of Women Voters of the United States. Maria Isabel Anit-Sahali is the Dean of Faculty of Law at the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez of Chile and Vice Chair of the Board of Advisors for the International IDEA. Idrissa Mahmoud Touali is the head of programs of Sierra Leone for the International IDEA, and Stuti Bhatt is a native of India, and she is currently a candidate for an LLM in International Legal Studies at New York University School of Law. And I'm going to turn the panel now over to Dr. Seema Shah, and she is going to give us a general overview of the global context on voter decline trends, causes, and implications. So, Seema, I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and we're happy to have you speak.
Okay, are the slides visible?
Yes.
Yes, okay, perfect. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. I'm going to talk a little bit just to set the stage for the panel today, and I will focus my comments on a couple different things. I'll start with just an overview of what our data tell us about where the world is in terms of the state of democracy, and then I will do a little bit of a deep dive into turnout trends with a special focus on the US and the latest election there. And then I'll end with what the data tell us about how women perform in terms of turnout, as well as other marginalized groups, historically disadvantaged groups. And then I'll end with, I won't say they're solutions, but some ideas to think about in terms of how to address some of the challenges related to turnout and electoral integrity more broadly. So before we begin, it's important to understand what we're talking about when we say democracy. So what you see on the screen is International IDEA's definition of democracy. It's pretty broad. It's broader than what a lot of other experts and academics use, but I think it's a useful concept. So we define democracy as popular control over decision makers and decision making, and equality in the exercise of that control. And we operationalize that definition through the conceptual framework you see here on the screen. So we divide democracy into four broad concepts: representation, which deals a lot with elections and how elections are run, as well as how parliament is able to operate in terms of checking power of the executive branch. Then we have rights, which deals with civil liberties, but also things like access to the courts and access to lawyers, as well as basic welfare and several measures of political equality. And then we have rule of law, which deals with judicial independence, rates of corruption, also safety, which is not something that is maybe traditionally measured in democracy. And then finally, we have participation, which covers voter turnout, but also covers the space for civil society to operate and also civic space more broadly. So how free are people to join associations in a society? There's two things I want to point out about the framework that's relevant for us. The first here is electoral participation. So this is where we measure turnout. And the second one is gender equality. And that's relevant for our discussion today as well. Electoral turnout in our measurement here looks at the rate of turnout compared to the voting age population. So it's not looking at turnout based on the number of registered voters, but more broadly voting age population. And gender equality is a pretty robust factor here. We're looking at 11 different indicators that measure everything from women's participation in civil society to how well they're represented in parliament, whether a woman has been or is head of state, education, access to education, as well as access to rights and services. So are there obstacles, no matter what the law says, are there practical obstacles to women being able to access services in society and also exercise their rights freely? Okay, so when we look at democracy around the world today, what our latest data shows us is that, unfortunately, democracy continues to decline. I'm sure everyone here has already heard that for many years, no matter how you measure it, quality of democracy seems to be declining. So what our latest data show us is that there are many more countries experiencing statistically significant declines than there are experiencing advances. Here you can really see the gap in recent years, the gap growing between the number of countries that are improving in some way versus the number of countries that are declining in some way. And when we say declining or advancing, we're talking about that framework I just showed you. So if there's a significant change in one of those factors that you saw on the screen, that's what we're measuring. One of those improving or declining, generally over a 5-year period, is our kind of baseline standard that we use to look at change over time. The one hopeful sign we see is in participation. So here what you see is that, again, more countries are declining than advancing. But when we compare participation measures to other measures, remember those other broad categories like representation, rights, rule of law, the declines here are much less than in those other categories. And you can see here that it's only recently that the declines have actually been outnumbering advances. The other thing to note about these graphs that you see on the screen is that the numbers generally are low. So while it's good news that not a whole lot of countries are experiencing dramatic declines, you could also interpret this graph to mean that, well, there hasn't been a lot of change either recently. So small numbers of countries are experiencing dynamism in this category. So that's also something to be aware of. Now, maybe unsurprisingly, what we have also found is that electoral participation has declined. So when we talked about declines, that first graph, let me just go back to that so you can see here. When we're talking about declining democracy, one other thing to note is that, sometimes when you hear democracy is declining, it's hard to understand what that tangibly means or what it means in practice. And what our data tell us is that some of the most steeply declining and broadly declining factors are credible elections and effective parliament, along with freedom of expression, freedom of association, economic equality, and access to justice. So when you put those together, think about what that means. It means the mechanisms we're using to elect our leaders are weak. Once they get into power, they're not able to exercise that power because effective parliament scores are declining. And then the people, who are the ultimate check on power, are not able to also exercise their power to check government because what they would use to check government, like freedom of expression, freedom of association, and access to justice, all of those are in decline. And many experts consider those factors to be the core of democracy. And so that's exactly what is weakening around the world. So that's really worrying. And now given that context, you might be unsurprised to hear that electoral participation rates have been declining over time. So in 2024, there were about 3 billion voters who were eligible to cast a ballot. And what we found, sadly, was that about a billion of them, about a third of those eligible voters, live in a country where the quality of elections has been declining over the past 5 years at least. And so when you put that all together, maybe it's not surprising that people are less enthusiastic about going out to vote. And we see this pattern in all the regions that we cover. So you can see here that some of the drops are more extreme than others, but all regions are dropping. Take a look at Europe, which started at a very high level, but which has been very steadily decreasing over time. It's only in Asia and the Pacific where we see some sort of relative cause for hope, where the declines have not been that sharp, especially in recent years. Some countries with the biggest changes in turnout are up here on the screen. And what this is measuring is these are the countries that had elections in 2024, where the change compared to the previous election that they had was the greatest. So we see big jumps in places like Azerbaijan and France, and big drops in places like Bangladesh. Now, if you've been following the news at all, a place like Bangladesh won't come as a surprise to you. There was a lot of unrest and massive protests that resulted in an overturn of power. And there's a lot of hope now for what a new democracy might look like in Bangladesh, but it did impact turnout rates. Now, if we look specifically at the US, what we see is that here up on the screen, you see a green line that shows you US turnout in presidential elections versus in legislative elections in the purple line. And you can see that things haven't been drastically changing at the presidential level over time. So about 62% turnout in 2020. What we know is that although the numbers are not yet final, we know that in 2024, turnout was about 64%. This is also measured according to voting age population, so everyone above the age of 18 in the US. And it was the second largest turnout in US history after 2020. Now, if we put US in the context of the world, what you see on the screen is that all the presidential elections that took place in 2024, and that dotted line is the global average in terms of turnout. So you can see the US was just a tiny bit above average, and Mexico, which is the only other North American country here that had a presidential election, is also right on that line. But you can take a look at how the US compares to other countries here on the screen. Okay, then if we look at congressional turnout, it's a little bit different. Here, when we look at how the United States fares when it comes to its other North American neighbors, you can see that Canada pretty much outranks the other countries over time, with a couple of exceptions here and there. Again, I don't think any of this is surprising for people who follow United States elections, especially congressional elections tend to receive much less attention than presidential elections. Now, when we take a look at the whole world, again, we see a really interesting finding, which is that women vote more than men across the board. This was seen in many different countries and regions, and you can see that over time, this has stayed steady. It wasn't always like this. Several decades ago, the gender gap in turnout was much more pronounced, with men voting much more than women. And there are lots of studies that have tried to understand why women now vote more than men. And there are a couple of different theories. One is that women are the ones who are often primary caregivers, and they therefore interact with institutions of the state much more regularly. So think about healthcare or Social Security or those kinds of institutions, schools, where you have to talk to government bodies. And so they have more of a personal stake in the election, so the theory goes, and so they're more likely to turn out. Studies have also found that some of this gap can be attributed to the fact that there's more exposure to political education these days, even in places where women are not necessarily encouraged to receive that education. They're accessing the news and commentary and other analysis on social media more and more privately. And so one theory is there's more political education available and that they're able to access. And so again, the stakes for them personally to vote in an election are higher. Then there are also cases where the electoral management body will make a particular effort to, promote more women's involvement. This was the case in India recently, where the EMB went out and made a point of having civic education programs that promoted women's participation. So there's lots of different theories about this, but the numbers across the board recently show that women vote more than men. One other thing to think about that I thought was really interesting was that there was a study done in Costa Rica, which showed that not only do women vote more than men, they're more influential in terms of children. So women have a much higher rate of influencing what's called political socialization in their children than men do. And so we all know that, children look to their parents as models, but apparently the impact of women voting is much higher than men on then the behavior of their children, especially at that crucial age when children become eligible to vote. So if they see their mothers voting around that time when they become newly eligible, they're much more likely to then vote for the rest of their lives. Okay. International IDEA also did a study last year to look and see how minority groups around the world feel about democracy and feel about how much access they have to democratic institutions compared to majority groups. And what we found is that minorities actually don't consistently vote more or less than majority groups. So here on the screen, you can see some of the countries that we covered in our survey, and you can see that it varies. In some places, minorities do vote more. In other cases, they do not. And then we also looked at low-income groups. And of course, there's often an overlap between low-income groups and marginalized or minority communities. And here you can see that members of low-income groups were less likely to vote than those in other income groups. And again, there are lots of theories about that. So why does low turnout matter? It matters for lots of reasons. First and foremost, if low numbers of people are voting, it automatically results in unbalanced representation. So if only a few people are casting ballots, then the people who are elected to power only feel beholden to those few people. And what we find is that that opens the door to patronage and corruption. In addition to that, what we find is that often the power is not only more concentrated, it's more concentrated among people who already have power and wealth. And so you're increasing the divides between people, the haves and the have-nots in society, and making it much harder for elected representatives to have legitimacy much more broadly. So then in the long term, you can imagine how that can really create factions in a society, which is really dangerous for democratic cohesion and social group cohesion in general. Why do we think voter turnout is declining around the world? Again, there are many, many theories. One is that levels of interest in politics is declining. In the West, theorists say that this is because of growing emphasis on individualism and isolation, which results in weaker levels of civic culture. So if you're staying at home and focusing on your own nuclear family, instead of going out and joining clubs, joining associations, going to neighborhood meetings, going to park cleanups or whatever social political activities might be available, then you tend to not feel like you're part of something broader. You're not part of a community. You have less stake in the well-being of the entire group. You're only thinking about yourself. And in that case, then you think, well, one vote isn't really going to matter. And if everyone thinks that way, then of course it impacts turnout much more broadly. Other studies have shown that practicalities matter. So in a place where election day is not a public holiday and people have to sacrifice salaries to go vote, they're much less likely to vote. If polling stations are not well distributed so that people can access them easily and are not open long enough so that people have time in the day to go vote, they're not going to. If you don't have special procedures like mobile voting stations for rural communities or for nomadic communities, then that decreases the chances of them being able to participate. And then we have special voting procedures like mobile voting, mail-in voting, proxy voting. If those things are not made available, then it just decreases the chances that people who simply have busy lives or are otherwise disadvantaged, maybe they're they're not mobile because they're sick or whatever it might be, it just means that they can't vote. So those things also matter a lot. We also know that what's called an inaugural election, so after a transition, when you have an election, you might see much higher numbers than what's considered normal. Or if it's a first election in a new democracy, you'll see a lot of enthusiasm. And then it's very normal for the numbers to go down after that election. So some of this is about keeping it in perspective. But of course, if you see declining numbers year after year after year, that's another problem. So what should we do? This is not an easy question to answer, but the very first thing I want to say is that we really, really need more disaggregated data. We do not have gender disaggregated data or any other kind of disaggregated data, age, ethnicity, income level, none of those things at a disaggregated level across the world. And so it's very hard to collect and monitor these kinds of trends for these communities. And if we can't monitor the trends, then we can't know who's having problems and how to address them. So we really need more data, and that means more resources for election management bodies and statistics offices who collect this kind of information. We also need to address those practicalities. That's a really easy one. Make election day a public holiday. Think about special voting arrangements for the sectors of your society who are more hard pressed to be able to reach the ballot box. And then finally, the hardest one, which is personal investment in governance. All those things about isolation and individualism, access to education, polarization, those are very hard to address. But we have to think about what we can do to bring people together again so that they feel more connected not only to each other, but to their leaders, so that you feel like your life is actually impacted by the result of the election, which of course makes you more likely to go out and vote. I'll just end by saying that it's also worth thinking about what it could mean that people don't feel like it matters who wins the election. If they don't feel like it's worth their time to vote, then what does that say about what the government is able to deliver versus not? And I will just leave it there. Thank you very much.
Seema, thank you so much. That was so informative, and it sets a good context for the rest of our discussion. So I appreciate how it was very complex, and you covered it in a very short period of time. So
Thank you.
yeah, and it's a good springboard for the rest of our panelists. So I'm going to give a general opening question for all of our panelists. And the question, you have about 2 minutes to respond. But what is the most significant trend you have observed in voter participation in your country over the past few elections, whether an increase, decrease, or a shift in engagement? And what factors do you think are driving that change? So I'm going to go first to Selena.
Thank you, Connie. It's so great to be here with everyone. Hello, hello. Yeah, I think Dr. Seema did a really great overview of the decline that we've seen and just the patterns that we've seen, not only in the US, but across. And so, of course, in the United States in 2024, we saw a decline in voter participation with about 3 million individuals opting out of casting a ballot versus who had casted a ballot in 2020. Around the country, we saw increased voter registration of youth, but less turnout in 2020 than in 2020. So just to put this in context, in 2016 and 2020 and 2024 were the highest turnout in the history since 1828. And so going back a long time. So 2016, there was about 136 million people who voted. In 2020, 158. And then 2024, it dropped to 155, just under 156 million people. And so again, these were the top turnout elections since 1828, but still we're seeing almost like a roller coaster of impact in terms of cycle to cycle, how people are participating. To me, I think in the democracy space, what's driving the change is really a couple of things. So communication, mis and disinformation is on the rise in a really important but bad way. And so the communication messaging to voters is kind of up in the clouds too. Like we're using very political terms, very terms that aren't always approachable to everyday people. And so I think that's one of the things that's making it harder to connect with people who are dealing with everyday issues about the potholes in their neighborhood, about the schools and what books their children have access to, about the city council and the school boards and things like that. And so making sure that it's very comprehensive. But I think in general, the barrage of mis and disinformation is having a tremendous impact on chilling voter participation. And I talk about how we might increase voter turnout. I think Dr. Seema covered this as well in terms of what we can do. And so I think for sure the three factors that she laid out are going to be very important. But I want to just take a minute and talk about apathy. Apathy is, of course, the emotional indifference, people not having feeling towards doing something or motivation to do something. This is not about apathy. This is not about people not wanting to change their community and not wanting to change how their communities are run. This is about voter suppression and the government and other folks using as many tactics as they can to see how much they can put in front of people to discourage them from participation, whether it's having elections only during working hours, having congressional hearings at 2 o'clock during the day when people are at work, not having accessibility on Saturdays to vote in early voter registration periods. And so we really have to think about people not participating beyond the term of apathy, because what's really happening is that people are having enormous barriers put in front of them that make it nearly impossible for people to participate successfully. So I will just say that those are the things that we are thinking about in terms of the voter turnout, how people are showing up, and what's causing obstacles for them to do that. So I think having accurate information as often as possible as a counter narrative to what's happening is going to be really critical in making sure people feel empowered and understand how they can vote effectively.
I'm going to turn it over to Isabel.
Thank you, Connie. And thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you. So I'm from Chile. And just to give you a context, from 2020 to 2024, so in 4 years, we had 3 national referendums, 2 elections for constitutional assemblies, and then also general elections and local elections. So we had 4 years of a massive electoral process in different fronts. But there's many interesting things to talk about, but we have so little time. So let me just show you how can rules change behavior. So we had voluntary voting for 10 years. And we saw a small electoral turnout, around 35% for presidential elections. It got almost a little bit over 40%. So we switched back to mandatory voting with automatic registration. So everybody over 18 years old has to vote. And what we have seen is that over the last few years, we are seeing a turnout of 85%. So we had a huge shift in terms of people going to vote. And it had been an interesting conversation because many people said, look, people got accustomed to vote. Many of the young people had never voted before. So maybe this rule will not be observed. Maybe we will just pay the fine. It's not a big fine. So maybe people will pay the fine and will spend their Sunday doing another thing. And we saw that people went back to voting. And that has shifted the conversation in terms of what are the roles of rules in terms of how do we bring people back to vote. And what has been just 2 things that had been interesting over these last few years is that especially in the referendums, we had 3 constitutional referendums, is that people said I'm voting because it's important. So in the second constitutional process, which was a process that we saw a lot of voter fatigue. People were fed up with talking about the Constitution, so people were disengaged. Many of us thought that maybe we would see some of that decline, and people said, no, voting is important. So bringing that back, that spirit has been very important across the political spectrum. And the other thing is that what we saw is that strong electoral institutions make a difference. And CIMA has written a lot about this, but we have a history of an electoral institution which shows rapid results. Everything is published online. We have not moved into big changes in how we vote. We still vote with pen and paper, but we see that it's a very open process, and we saw changes in facilitating that people would go vote very nearby to where they live. And we have seen that this trust in institutions, in electoral processes and in electoral institutions has also been key for people to keep going even twice a year back to the voting stations and casting their ballot. So thank you, Connie. I think it's a very different experience, but it's interesting to see how the role of institutions and of rules play a role on how to people back to the ballot.
Yes, thank you, Isabel. It's really interesting, I think, to see what happens in different parts of the world. And we have a very global audience with us. So everything that is presented is so meaningful. And I'm going to turn it next over to Idrissa in Sierra Leone.
Thank you very much, Connie. And it's Isabella, thank you very much. I wanted to say it's even more different and even more presenting Sierra Leone as an outlier in this voter turnout debate when you look at statistics in Sierra Leone. We don't have mandatory registration. We don't have mandatory voting, but the number of people registering and voting in every electoral cycle since the reintroduction of democratic governance in 1996 has significantly increased in Sierra Leone. We voted at a time when the civil war was still raging. The turnout was about 60%. When we moved to 2022, 5 years later, 2002, 5 years later, it's in the mid-70s. And that has been the consistent voter turnout, sometimes even 80%. So the question is, in a world and in a continent where people are becoming disinterested in going out to vote, why are the numbers increasing in a country like Sierra Leone? Do they have trust in the institutions? Do they believe that democracy matters for them? The evidence thus far suggests no. What has facilitated that turnout is a very bifurcated political system where people think that my party being in power provides access to corrupt and perverted access to state resources. And so voting becomes existential rather than a trust in the institutions themselves. So it's in fact a reverse argument of democracy and the democratic discourse more generally. So if in the last election since 1996, power has changed hands twice between 2 leading political parties, the APC and the SLPP. The current party in power is the SLPP. It largely draws its support from a southeastern base of the country, which is largely Mende ethnic group, whilst the APC, which has also been in power for 2 consecutive terms, draws its support from the north and the northwestern part of the country, largely dominated by one tribe. So what motivates and mobilizes people to turn out to vote is the commitments that my party is going to be in power. Therefore, my brother will be appointed, my cousin will have a government job, and eventually I will benefit. If I don't, then it becomes existential threat. And you see the evidence across the board, where if your party loses, some jobs as simple as some middle-level civil servants, you can be dismissed. So voting becomes existential rather than an important part of the democratic discourse. But how does young people and women show up in all of this process? The population of Sierra Leone shows that women makes up about 51 to 52% of the population, right? So they constitute a larger part of those that are eligible to vote and those that are eligible to register, but they don't necessarily register as much as men. And there are several issues responsible for that. It can be part of the conversation as we move on. But that is changing, especially in the last election in 2023, where you have a significant increase in the number of women registering and turning out to vote. And one of that action is affirmative action. We had the Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Act in 2022, the GIWI Act, which provides for a 30% quota for female representation in parliament and in local government. These mobilize women to participate. Is that mobilization equal across different locations and districts among the educated and the uneducated? The data says, it says no. But consistently, women have not participated as much as women. And I'll go back to, and this is where I will stop, I'll go back to Seema's point about, do they want to participate or they are suppressed to participate? I will say they are suppressed not to participate because politics in Sierra Leone is very masculine. And if you're a woman, you are very active in politics, you can be associated. The very easy word to say, you must be sleeping with one of the very top politicians. So an active female politician in Sierra Leone is not so viewed positively within society. And so women are more shy. And elections in Sierra Leone are very violent. Because they are violent, women are at risk. And all of these factors take them away from the ballot box. But the 2023 election, with affirmative action, see more women participating in governance. So we are an outlier where voting numbers are increasing, more women are participating, but it's not because they believe in the democratic process and the institutions responsible for democracy. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Adressa. And I think that take on the cultural bias, the view within your country of women politicians is very interesting. Something maybe many of us have not known before or thought about. And I'm going to, but thank you so much. And Studi, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Connie, for the question. Thank you, Dr. Seema, for the presentation. So when we look at the Indian voter participation, the most striking thing isn't just if it's up or down, but how are people engaging? It's far more assertive and more identity driven. And essentially, we're seeing voter mobilization along with very strong identity lines like religion, caste, or the geographical region where they come from. Essentially, like those states who share a border with countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, or Nepal or Bhutan. Campaigns are highly charged, and the participation is about defending your own group and not just casting a ballot. You also just get a surge in women participation, which is fantastic and showing a real shift in political awareness. And this is crucial, regional demographic disparities persist. Urban versus rural migrant worker, caste, and religious polarizations are still a very major issue in India. And of course, the rise of strong national leaders and the influence of national narratives or religion are heavily impacting the voting patterns. What's driving this would be the identity politics as usual, and parties are deliberately creating a us versus them dynamic, which fuels emotional voting. It's not about the financial situation, it's more about who stands for what and which identity they represent. And social media would be yet another massive driver, especially for young people like us, because, and there are times where it also spends misinformation. The media landscape is polarized, creating an echo chamber. Economic and social anxieties are motivating voters who are demanding change. And as I mentioned, the strong national leaders and national narratives heavily influence the voting. So despite the improvements and systematic issues like voter registration and migrant worker disempowerment, these are still hindering the participation. So to sum it up, I would say that Indian voting is moving away from passive duty to an active duty. There is no mandatory rule for you to vote, but people are still participating, and it's a highly charged engagement. And this has big implications for the future of Indian democracy, and it's something we really need to watch closely.
Thank you, Studi. And I'm going to now turn this over to a round of questions that will be tailored to each individual panelist. So the first question is to Selena Stewart. And Selena, the US has been seeing an increase in restrictions on voting access, from voter ID laws to gerrymandering. How are these legal and structural barriers affecting turnout?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think turnout is an important indicator of the health of democracy. I can't say that enough. According to the American Presidential Project, they described healthy democracies as inclusive, where voter registration and the access to vote is easy and accessible, and where there are competitive racers that usually yield higher turnout. But we've definitely been seeing an increase in restrictions and even narrative, like I said, propaganda to restrict voting. For example, in California, following the devastating fires, the president conditioned relief funding for people's homes and things on whether the state would put in place a strict voter ID law. And so that obviously caused a lot of stress because California has one of the most robust voting access parameters in the country, really, besides places like Minnesota and others. And then just this week, we saw the weakening, firing, and funding reduction at CISA, which is the Cyber Security Infrastructure Security Agency. And that agency in particular coordinates with federal agencies, state and local governments to make sure that elections are administered effectively. So reducing funding at this time, especially when there are currently 8 states that still have elections. I know there's a lot of focus on the presidential elections, but elections happen all year, every year. And so there's 8 states that are having elections right now, 2 of which have federal elections, and 6 that have statewide elections like gubernatorial elections, AG elections, etc. And so this really has an impact on whether or not people turn out, just the narrative and the propaganda, but also just the restrictions that are happening that make it more difficult for people to have effective election infrastructure in place.
Thank you, Selena. And the next question goes out to Isabel. Chile recently held a constitutional referendum with significant public engagement. What lessons can be learned from this process regarding voter participation and democratic trust?
There's many lessons, but let me give you a few of the things that we have observed in Chile. One is that the mobilization of new voters was a key issue, especially we had a social uprising at the end of 2019, which opened the constitutional discussion. So what we saw is that this mobilization process, right, of protest, of social upheaval, was a motivation for many new actors into the more institutional part of the process of going through the referendum and then the electoral processes. So that was, especially for young people, a new source of participation into the general electoral process. The other role, I think it's important to put it again and again, is the role of political parties. So what we saw is that in the first constitutional process that we went through, we saw a lot of independents, people who had no previous political experience, who didn't come from political parties, and also leaders of social movements. They were the most elected people. So out of an assembly of 150, it was around 105 people who were independents, and they ran as independents. And that at the beginning was very celebrated. It was a new scenario, new actors, new people. But then we saw the costs of that, of people who had no experience in political negotiation and no sort of previous exercises of bringing together a plethora of issues. So when you go into a constitutional discussion, you're deciding on social rights, but you're also deciding on having a presidential system or not, and you're also deciding what's the role of the local governments. So what we saw is that fragmentation was a key factor of our failure. We do not have the key answer because we failed at this process again in 2023. But I would say that a lesson was how to achieve a balance into the role, the key issue of bringing together new faces, new leaders, people from diverse issues, with the role that political parties have to play in terms of achieving a functional legislative or assembly, whatever type of thing. And I think in that role, especially where we have seen afterwards, how do we inform voters? Voting has become more complex. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of information on social media, but also the electoral process has become more complex. And how do we go about informing to making it easier to vote is key for voters to understand. And what we see is that in many cases, people turn out to vote because in our case now, they want to avoid the fine, but they just put a big X on the vote. So how do we reduce that in terms of making people cast a valid ballot, right? And that's, I also think, an issue for the future. And I don't have the key of how to go about a successful constitutional process, as we have failed twice in Chile over the last 4 years.
But you keep on making the effort, and I think that is the most important takeaway from that. And Idrissa, I was going to ask you, in Sierra Leone has faced election-related violence and political instability. So how has this affected voter turnout, particularly among women and vulnerable groups?
Thank you very much, Connie. Every election since the commencement of multi-party democracy in Sierra Leone in 1996 has been full of violence, and there's been loss of life, destruction of property, every election. However, I've taken read of almost all the elections observation reports in 2023. The 2023 election, relative to all the other 5 elections from 1996, has been described by most, both national and international elections observation missions, as the most peaceful. However, and this is the irony, however, from 1996, when you had 60% of the people turning out, of registered voters turning out, there's been a steady increase. In fact, the 2 most recent elections in 2018, the voter turnout was 84%. In 2023, voter turnout was 82.3%. So how then do you square violence with high voter turnout? The other question has been, well, it's possible maybe we would have had a 90% voter turnout. Those ones who have not turned out is as a result of the violence associated with the elections. What is not available in Sierra Leone is a set of comprehensive research that actually provides some form of, even of a causality, more of a correlation between elections-related violence and voter turnout. We don't have that kind of academic research that informs that. However, anecdotally and program-level engagement and research that we do at International IDEA. For instance, as part of our program currently in Sierra Leone, we supported a group called 50/50. It's a gender parity group to conduct a research to look at how affirmative action made possible by the 2022 Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Act contributed to enhancing women's political participation and representation. That study shows that women's representation, at least in the National Assembly, increased from 12% in 2018 to 30% in 2023. Significant increase as a result of the affirmative action. However, in that study, women also noted that some of the major reasons why they don't register, they don't turn out to vote, is the violent nature of elections. And sometimes the distance between a registration center and a polling center. Some people in rural Sierra Leone have to walk as far as 5 miles to cast their ballot. And when women have complex and more family-related engagements to provide feeding for their kids, to tend for their sick members of the family, women still carry the majority of the home chores. When they have to do that, when they compare between going out to register and going out to vote, they will prioritize their families over going out to turn the ballot, to cast their ballot. However, evidence of, and this is one research, it's a very small scale research that we're going to do with a national organization in Sierra Leone called CHADI to look at incidents of electoral justice. It's a bit of violence analysis, but electoral justice. How many electoral related offenses or cases that were reported to the police? How have these cases been handled? But the evidence shows that when violence occurs, it affects women more than any other category. The exception is for young people who are both victims of violence and also perpetrators of violence during elections. But the evidence that is emerging currently shows that when women don't turn out for vote, the three biggest reasons are because they are afraid of election violence. Either the registration center or the polling center is too far off of their homes, or they prioritize their families over casting ballot. But you have increasingly in the last 5 elections, voter turnout is increasing. But if you look at who is more qualified to vote in terms of the population, it's more women. However, men turn out to vote more than women. And the number one reason why women don't vote is associated with violence.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Stuti. And Stuti, India has one of the world's largest electoral systems, but voter participation varies by region and demographic. What legal or systemic barriers impact turnout?
Thank you for the question. So when we look at India, the world's largest democracy, it's easy to be impressed by the sheer scale of elections. But if we dig a little deeper, we see that the voter participation isn't as uniform as we might think. There are some real tangible barriers that keep people from voting, and it's not just about the lack of interest. First off, just getting registered to vote can be a huge hurdle. A lot of people, especially those who move around for work or those who are on the margins of the society, they simply don't get to exist on the voter rolls. The paperwork, the process, it can be incredibly difficult, especially if you don't have the right documents or don't really understand how it works. And if you move, forget about it. Updating your address is a bureaucratic nightmare. And then there's the problem of domestic migrant workers. You know, you can only vote from where your domicile is, and you have to be physically present. India has this massive youth population, but millions of them have left their home for work or education. And going back to home for vote, that costs a humongous amount of time or money, which is a lot for them, and they just don't want to participate. We're talking about a huge chunk of population, roughly over 350 million youth that are between the age of 15 to 24 years old. And then we have the point of poverty and the lack of education. So when we're worried about putting food on the table, voting might not be your top priority. And if you haven't had so much of schooling, the whole election process can be a really confusing process. Accessibility is yet another big issue, and polling places aren't always easy to get to, especially if you're disabled or live in a very remote area. And even if you can get there, there might be decent roads or public transportation, but it still won't be very friendly for your pocket. And even if the government has made arrangements for you, it's still not very convenient. And then we have errors on the voter rolls. If your name is spelled wrong or if there's an information missing, these little mistakes can would help the government agencies to disbar you from voting. So even if you're eligible voter, you cannot cast your vote. And in some area, there's a fear and intimidation. Powerful people or the criminal groups try to scare people away from voting, especially in places with violence or corruption. And a lot of people, particularly the young people and those in rural areas, just don't understand how voting works or why is it important. And they might not know much about the candidates or the issues. And finally, many citizens lack the required identity to vote. So I think it's a real mix of red tape, practical difficulties, and social problems that keep people from voting. It's not just a simple problem, and there's definitely no easy solution.
Thank you. And our next question goes back to Selena. In the 2020 and 2022 elections, they saw a rise in misinformation and distrust in election processes. So how has this shaped voter confidence, and what is being done to rebuild the trust?
Sorry, I forgot to hit that little mute button. So yeah, 2020 and 2022, we really saw a lot of the testing ground for mis and disinformation, particularly on social media. I would argue that it wasn't just misinformation, that was also disinformation. The only difference between mis and disinformation is intent, right? Misinformation, you say something and don't know that it's untrue, and disinformation is when you're saying something that you know is untrue and causes harm. And so I think that with social media in particularly, it was spread faster. The evolution and speed of AI, artificial intelligence, was also used in 2022 and 2024 to make the mis and disinformation spread more quickly through graphics, through social media like TikTok, Instagram, even Facebook. And what we're seeing now is, social media companies refusing to fact check, refusing to ensure that there is accurate information in the ether, particularly around voting. And so one of the things that the League is doing is we have a program, Women Defend Democracy. And within that campaign, we have the Democracy Truth Project, where we are dissecting and watching trends across social media in particular to see what mis and disinformation is traveling and what people are picking up on, and then combating that by putting accurate information out, not just at the national level, but encouraging local and state leagues to do the same. And so one of the things we've done since 2024 and more recently is have an education series online. It is on Instagram and Facebook, where we are sharing just basic civic information. One of the most searched questions on Google that first couple of days after the election is, how do I change my vote for president? People literally did not know that once you cast your ballot, it's a done deal, right? And then we saw, more recently in January, right following the inauguration, there was this comment that went viral. It was, them talking about what's happening and what the president was doing, and particularly encroaching on congressional authority. And one of the questions was, or comments was, why are you focusing on the House and Senate? This is really about Congress. And we were like, whoa, this person doesn't realize that the House and Senate, that actually is the two chambers that make up Congress. And then someone, being very facetious, responded, oh my God, wait till you figure out what this legislature thing is all about. But it's really about people not understanding just basic civics in the United States, and it may be abroad, I don't know. But I know in America that there is a lack of people understanding how government works, what government officials handle particular issues that affect their everyday lives. No matter what election we are talking about, someone on that ballot is going to affect your everyday life. And so for us, we are trying to make sure that we are making civics more 4th to 6th grade level, like very plain and straightforward, not using very political terms, very straightforward language to let people know. And we've done things like, what is the SAVE Act? What does Congress do? We're about to do something on what is a tariff, and what does it mean to hold a green card? We had the Columbia University student who was caught up in an ICE raid or intentionally targeted by ICE, and the university actually helped facilitate that, right? Which was incredibly problematic here, right in New York, where I'm sitting. And so we think about things like that. And so we're trying to figure out ways to get very basic civic education to people in mass, and make sure that people understand that mis and disinformation is a real thing. We should think about mis and disinformation just like literacy tests, like poll tax. We should think of it as just as detrimental as those things that happened many decades ago.
Thank you, Selena. And for Maria, Isabel, in Chile, both constitutional processes included rules on gender parity for its elections. With the inclusion of these rules, what lessons were learned from the experience?
Actually, it's a very unique case, and I think it can be of interest here. For the first so we have a traditional gender quota that you can observe in different countries around the world for Congress and local elections. But we change that rule for both constitutional processes. So it's a unique rule that actually it was a full gender parity rule. So it was not only on the amount of women candidates, but also it's on the final people who got elected. It had to be a 50-50 assembly. So it was the first exercise actually in the world of having a very strict rule of gender parity. And as many things change from one constitutional process to the other, because they were almost completely opposite in how they were designed, the gender parity rule actually was used in both processes. But I want to say one thing. For those who are interested in this issue, I think it's very important to actually go into the details of the rule, which I have no time to explain, because in both processes, actually, it worked. However, because the rule was very strict, it required of men who were elected to actually withdraw from being elected in order for a woman from their same political party or same political list to occupy the post. And I think that generated an intense conversation of how strict should the rule be in terms of 50-50. And what we saw afterwards was a sort of backlash from some part of the political spectrum regarding how do we design these electoral rules. So it was a very successful rule, but I would say it was interesting to watch, especially from what we're seeing now. This was designed in 2020, and then again at the end of 2022. How do we design these kinds of rules to have a very effective gender parity, but that doesn't generate afterwards a backlash? And let me tell you one last thing. We had local elections last year in Chile, so that doesn't go into the gender parity rule, that goes by the general rules. What we have seen is that there was no bias in terms of how much money their campaigns got, but what we saw is that we have very few women candidates. And that impacted the election afterwards very deeply in terms of how many, for example, women mayors do we have in the country, or regional governors. Those numbers are very low still. And what we have seen is that there's still a big room to improve the role of political parties in selecting women as candidates and promoting more women to be candidates, especially in the local elections. We see something that has appeared in the conversation, a lot of bias against women, but also women that have to, for example, run for office, but also care for small children or their parents or their grandparents, and go around the country trying to manage all. And also a big, especially in social media, aggressive campaigns still based on gender stereotypes. So bringing more women as candidates has a lot to do still with the general environment against women, but also of how do we generate rules for them to be very active in politics.
Thank you. And Idrissa, 2010 was the last affirmative action strengthening gender equality and women's empowerment in Sierra Leone. So how has this affected the election and participation of women in governance and decision-making in Sierra Leone?
It's been quite significant, and it will surprise. Well, it's not even surprising when you look at the role of women in politics and political processes. They're very active in the pre-elections phase. So, for instance, you cannot mobilize a political rally without women, because they are very active in bringing the female folks to participate in meetings, to join political conversations and political dialogues. But when it translates for them to participate more meaningfully, to hold positions within the political system, to hold positions of trust, that's where the problem lies. So whilst they turn out within their political parties, and there's a question in the comment very similar to yours, most of the violence and all of these issues that happen against women, a good number of that violence is intra-party. So people within the same political parties. I am contesting against a woman to become a district chairman of the party. So that violence comes from among members of the same political party, and it makes it difficult for law enforcement agencies to be able to police that process. What that means is women have been forced to abandon political careers, and the growth of the internet means that women these days is socially and emotionally bullied, trolled within social media, and that limits their ability to be able to effectively participate. In the research we did with 50/50, you will find out how the extent to which political actors, especially men, will go to ensure that they prevent women from meaningfully participating in political roles. For instance, the Act says at any time you nominate 3 people to go to parliament, the 3rd person should be a woman. And because the names can be similar between a man and a woman, I will nominate Idrissa and nominate Mohammed, both of them men. But I've also nominated another male, but in the form which they submit to the Electoral Commission, they will put F to meet the requirements of the law. When the Electoral Commission run a sample, use the national identification number, they find out that Zainab, who is nominated as a female, is actually a gentleman by the national registration number. And so the Electoral Commission had to bring in political parties to challenge them, and they discovered more than 10 out of the 17 political parties at least have lied once in terms of their nomination where women are supposed to be. And even where that provision exists, you nominate, in every 3 nominations, there has to be 1 woman. The law does not make provision where does the women sit. Should they be at number 1 at the nomination or number 3? So you have certain districts that has 6 seats. The 2 political parties, each won 2 each. But because they nominated the women at the bottom of the list just to miss the requirements of the law, you found out that said, yes, there's a 30% nomination, but there's not a 30% representation, which is actually the provision of the law. And so increasingly, whilst the law supported female political participation, women came out more. They've done so at their own risk, including physical attacks and social bullying within social media. How this can be handled, a lot of advocacy is ongoing, but social norms takes a very long time to change. And when violence is within political party, it becomes even more difficult to handle.
Thank you. And Studi, what role do the courts and the international legal frameworks play in ensuring free and fair elections, especially in regions experiencing democratic backsliding? And how does this affect women and marginalized groups?
Okay, so when we talk about courts and international law in elections, especially in places where democracy is slipping, it's a really big deal. But it's not as simple as one size fits all thing, especially when we look at how it affects women and marginalized groups. First, I think we should start talking about the core roles where national courts, they're like the last line of defense. They're supposed to keep the government in check, make sure election laws are followed, settle disputes, and keep the electoral bodies independent. In places where democracy is falling apart, these independent courts are absolutely vital to stop things like manipulation, fraud, or disinformations. And then on the international sides, we have treaties, organizations, which set a global standard for fair elections. They send observers, write reports, and basically try to hold countries accountable, or at least portray a report which gives the exact details of how things are, irrespective of the political regime of that country. They also give technical help to strengthen the democratic institutions. Now, how does this affect women and marginalized group? Well, in places where democracy is sliding, they're often the most vulnerable. Existing inequalities gets worse, and they are more likely to face things like voter suppression or intimidation. But courts and international framework can also be the biggest protectors. Legal challenges can fight discriminatory laws. International pressure can stop the violation. For example, the court can rule that a certain ID requirements are unfair to a group who are less likely to have them, and thus change the voting outcomes of that particular elections. And fair elections are crucial for empowering these groups to have a voice. International organizations can also run programs that specifically help women to get involved in political environments. However, in the backsliding countries, courts might be politicized and international pressure might be weak. Authoritarian regimes often target these groups specifically to make them even less powerless. So it's a tough situation. I feel like the key thing to remember is that effectiveness of this court and a framework depends on them being independent and impartial. And the civil society also plays a huge role in monitoring elections and advocating for these groups. And ultimately, we need to address the root causes of inequality to make sure that everyone can participate in the in the elections equally. And basically, courts and international law are essentials for fair elections, but the impact is essentially important for women and marginalized groups who often are the ones who suffer the most when democracy starts to crumble.
Thank you. I know that we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to condense some of the questions that I had prepared for our panelists, maybe to include in your final comments about voter confidence and mistrust, and also youth engagement or disengagement in your countries. But I'm going to ask a final round of questions to be answered, and and then we'll move on to the question and answers from some of our audience. But we're really like to focus on solutions, actionable strategies. You know, we want people to have something to take away from this discussion. And I know that no one has all the answers, but whatever answers you think are probable and might work would be very valuable to add to this discussion. So what is the most urgent reform taken or needed in your country or region to strengthen voter participation? And what role should international organizations and civil society play in reversing voter decline? So if you could wrap up in a couple of minutes your answers to those questions, we really love to hear about your thoughts on actionable strategies that would increase voter participation in your countries and parts of the world. So
I can start real quick.
yes.
Okay, so yeah, even with everything happening in the country, there are great ways to get engaged. And so I think one, those opportunities to engage include, in the US in particular, we've seen a lot of protests and boycotts, whether that is people showing up and making their voices heard or withdrawing their dollars to show that they are their displeasure with a particular thing. That is all things that can go a long way. And right now, we also have government meetings at the local, state, and there's a lot of congressional, federal town halls. People are showing up to share how they feel about how the government is going. More civics information, leaning into educational opportunities, sharing that education with family, friends, young people in your world so that they know what's happening and what these things and what these people do. Making voter registration easier. And so we're pushing back to make sure that we protect as much as possible voter registration and voting in this country. And then I would say for young people in particular, we saw in 2024, young people are interested in issues and not people. They did not vote for a particular person. They were voting for things that they cared about. And so when you are talking with young people or just voters in particular, or people who you need to get engaged, focus on the issues and asking the questions about what matters to them. And then kind of starting that conversation from that point. What matters to you? Here are the issues, and here are the people doing things that actually make what you want possible.
Thank you.
I would add some general ideas. One is that the reform that we did, which was not a major reform, but it was allowing people to vote as near as they can to their home. So you can go walking or biking, but not very far away, has motivated a lot of people to, for example, go vote as a family. We vote on a Sunday. What happens is that it's a very family-oriented day in terms of you would go vote together and afterwards you have lunch. People in Chile tend to vote just before lunchtime. And so it becomes easier for people from all ages to go and vote together. And that I think had impacted, so people motivate their family group. So if I'm gonna go vote, I will bring my brother or my father and we would go vote together. The other thing is, for the gender parity rule, I think it's a very interesting example of how women in very different places, especially the academia, can contribute to making an electoral reform on a specific issue, because that rule came from women that work in law and in political science and in different women's movement to bring together a specific rule that would go into the electoral reform. So they put together a very specific reform. And I think, and it was a cross-party movement from women to go and include it. So it was not an idea that came from the left or from the right. It was experts and people who were working on women's issues that came together and said, this is a very broad spectrum idea, and here's how you could go about it. And the third thing that I would say is that electoral institutions are key in terms of maintaining trust in the electoral processes. We have seen how electoral institutions are being attacked in the various countries. And I think, how do we strengthen them? How do we give them resources to deal with the new technologies? It's something that we have to put on the table, because the role that they play is key, especially for misinformation and disinformation. And if anybody's interested in following a case which has pros and cons, but it's very interesting how they're proceeding, the electoral institution and the issues of social media, it's the case of Brazil. They have a very active, very straightforward campaign, very different from what other countries are doing, but I think it's also something that we can grasp what electoral institutions are dealing with today.
Thank you.
Can I say one thing, which is just to build on what Selena said earlier, which is she said something about turnout being a good measure of the health of your democracy. And I think that's really true, especially because turnout is one of those statistics that is often collected, and then the media picks it up and everyone reads about it. But that statistic often reflects other things which are not brought to public attention, like what we found in our survey, which is that minority groups and historically marginalized groups don't have the same access to other things. It's not just elections, it's also other institutions, also the freedom to exercise their rights in the same way. And those things are all linked, of course, to elections, but to democracy much more broadly. And so the turnout is one indication of how certain groups are systematically marginalized in society. And so that brings me back to this issue about data. We need disaggregated data so that we can properly identify groups and be able to target them with appropriate interventions. Women are not a homogenous group, so we need to understand, how do low-income women vote or not vote, and what are their experiences with courts and election management bodies and all kinds of other things as well. So we really need disaggregated data. And in the US, one of the things that comes to mind is how this Voting Rights Act is being dismantled by the Supreme Court, and the disproportionate impact that has, obviously, on minority groups. And that is going to impact, it's already impacting turnout, but it's going to impact all kinds of other things as a knock-on effect as well. So I can't stress enough the importance of that disaggregated data.
Connie, in Sierra Leone, the evidence already has shown that affirmative action such as quota systems and legislations provides an opportunity to enhance women's participation. But those are entry-level kind of intervention. You cannot have a 30% for a set of people who constitute more than 52% of the population. We have to follow that up with norms change. And it's difficult to legislate for people to change their attitude. So investment in civic and voter education, engaging with citizens to understand that when women participate in the political process, you have better societies, more accountable government, you have more productive societies that contributes to the growth of a nation. That sense of education that brings in citizens in rural communities who sees that if my wife goes into politics, she's going to become promiscuous and all these other things. If we change those norms, it will contribute quite significantly in ensuring that we don't only put legislations that protects the right of women to vote. We don't only have quota systems that put a set of requirements to which women should be nominated. We're also changing norms, we're also changing attitudes. But we can also make voting easier for certain categories. But the point made by Dr. Seema is very important. We can only make those provisions if we have more data. We now know that we have more women than men. But how many rural women are actually turning out to vote? How many rural women in particular income quintile are actually voting? When we generate more of that research and understand why women are voting and why they are not, then we can provide a comprehensive support. And I'll end by saying the states, all of this, the individual national states have a significant role to play. If we look at violence as a threat to humanity, it does not only mean when it's perpetrated against women. Let's make election an easier process. While I was a student in the UK, I can go and cast my ballot and then go to the lecture room and don't have a problem. They've normalized voting. In this part of the world, you have to take a holiday, it becomes a threat. Parents are worried about what happened to their kids. They have to stay home. The security sector is more agile. The securitization and militarization of the democratic process threatens women's willingness to turn out to vote. We have to make democracy simpler, accessible, and guarantee as a right for women. Legislation plays a role, but norms change is very significant for us to reach that.
Thank you. And thank you for waving the banner for women, because it's not just a woman's issue for women to resolve. If we don't have men behind us, we're never going to achieve gender parity. So I applaud the work that you do and the champion for women that you are. Thank you so much. And Studi, would like to hear from you.
Yes. So I think when we talk about the most urgent reform that needs to be taken in India, it would be addressing the challenges that is faced by the migrant workers. India has a massive population of internal migrants, and these are people who are registered to vote in their home states only, but they work or study in a completely different state. So they're basically disenfranchised, and this isn't a small group we're talking about. It's more than 350 million people every year. So excluding them undermines the entire democratic process. And if we could just enable these migrant workers to vote remotely or even at their current location, would see a significant increase in participation of voting. And the financial and logistical barriers they face are immense, and overcoming them would be a huge effect. There's also a critical point that is often overlooked and somehow that severely damaged the integrity of election is the voting of people who are not registered in the voter list, specifically in the states that are sharing borders with countries like Bangladesh, and they have enormous amount of refugee inflows, and somehow due to corruption they are registered in the voter ballot system. So this also affects this does increase the voting turnout, but you could say it in a sense that it's not appropriate or correct enough. And going back to the migrant workers, if we could explore secure remote voting options and set up designated polling stations in major cities, it would simplify interstate vote transfers and consider how one nation, one election, or one voters list could help us. We would also need targeted voter education and outreach programs to inform migrant workers about their rights and options, and stricter verification processes, and a stronger focus on removing the voters who vote twice or are not given enough platform to get their voices heard. And to reverse the voter decline, international organizations and civil society have a distinct role. They can both set standard, offer technical aid, or educate voters and monitor the elections. The most effective approach, I would say, is the collaboration between both international organizations and the civil society to provide resources, expertise, and local knowledge or grassroots mobilization. I think together they can strengthen the free and fair election.
Thank you. Seema, I think that you have already answered the question that I was going to ask you about if you could recommend one concrete action to improve voter engagement globally, what would it be? And I think you keep going back to this disaggregated data. I don't know if there's something more you'd like to add to that, but we have a list of questions, and I welcome our panelists to respond to in the Q&A if they want to type in an answer that we may not have time to answer. But one of the questions that came up is what are barriers to this disaggregated data collection, and how can we help you to get the disaggregated data that you need? So I'm going to turn it over to you to answer in the best.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different factors. One is that there are concerns sometimes about privacy. So people, obviously your vote is confidential, or it should be. So people don't want to reveal and don't want to ask about demographic data, for example, of voters, because people get nervous that their identities will be revealed. But in other places, it's more about capacity. So there aren't enough people, or there isn't enough money to collect disaggregated data in any kind of systematic way. And then in other places, you're stopped because of things like violence and conflict around elections, which obviously disrupt voting, but also disrupt all the logistics around voting. So you can't monitor and track in the same way. And then there's also all kinds of political reasons why in some governments are either creating laws to suppress data collection or controlling who has access to data or who's allowed to collect it, because of worries about making that information public, and then seeing the reactions of groups who, now it's public knowledge that these groups are marginalized and there isn't action to address their concerns, et cetera. So there's a whole lot of reasons, and I think each of them probably needs a specific intervention.
Dr. Seema can add to that to say that most of it is the last point. To say it's a question of willingness. So, for instance, in Sierra Leone, the Electoral Commission does not provide disaggregated data by polling stations to look at women versus men. When they come out with the results, it says 1,000 people voted X. You want to know among them who are them are women, and this is very easy data that you can generate. It's already there, but it is tied to questions of trust on the electoral process. I'll give you an example. The statistical average for void votes, spoiled ballots in Sierra Leone in the last 5 years, in the last 5 elections, has not exceeded 5%. It's between 4 to 7%, right? In the last election, 2023 elections, the spoiled ballots was 0.23%. And the suspicion is what the Electoral Commission has done is to drag what would have been void votes, right, into valid votes for the ruling party. And if you then now, and this is the big argument that's ongoing, give us the disaggregated data. If you come to Sierra Leone, it's all over the place. Why is the disaggregated data? And this it doesn't cost them any extra resources. And so when I saw the question, what can we do? It's about states taking responsibility, providing legislation, mandating Electoral Commission to provide as basic data as that. If that is provided, it provides for us an entry point to understand who is voting. Are rural women voting? Are women in it? We already have certain figures. If you put that other filter into the who cast their ballots, it's just a couple of filters. It will allow us to know of the 20,000 people who voted, how many of them are women? How many of them are educated? How many of them have university degrees? How many of them are rural women? Once you filter that, you will see where the challenge is. But it's deliberate reluctance from Electoral Commission because of electoral manipulations reason. And this leads us to reduced confidence and trust in electoral institutions and the democratic process across the board, which is why in places like West Africa and the places where we come from, there is increasing citizens believing that democracy is not working for us. There's lack of access to public services. And when you have military regimes like what is happening in the Sahel, people jumping back into authoritarianism, they believe that if democracy is not answering my questions, if services are not provided, if democracy is violence against women, who makes up a significant proportion of the population, then I don't mind living in what you would call a semi-authoritarian government, as long as public services are being provided. We have to question the capacity and the willingness of state institutions to deliver this very important project that we call democracy.
And citizens and voters should also demand disaggregated data. People should say, for me to trust my election results, I need to see who's voting.
People are demanding for disaggregated data. The Electoral Commission is coming back to say, well, we're not under obligation. There is no legislation that mandate us to provide data. And I challenge them. It is good practice. There is no legislation, but there is good practice.
Yes.
Right now, we are going through legal reform. We are working through Parliament as a result of our program extension. We are providing capacity support within the Office of the Law Clerk. We're providing support within the judiciary to ensure we're going through about 44 legislative recommendations that emerge from the 2023 election. Some of them about security for women, increasing the affirmative action for women, ensuring that the vote is more disaggregated, ensuring that polling centers are more accessible. 44 legislations that we are trying to push through. We only have this year. The next electoral cycle is in 2028. If you're not able to push it from now to 2026, 2027 becomes the next electoral cycle. But it's about transparency of this institution. That's the fundamental challenge. And I think international engagement, international multilateral, there's need for a multilateral action. Sometimes even tying donor support to legal reform and ensuring that institutions of this nature provide the necessary information that supports the democratic process. It's part of the big project that you do what is right. I have access to the available information. I can use that information to challenge your decisions.
Thank you. Is there anything that anyone else would like to add in closing remarks? I mean, we've heard many of the significant answers that you've recommended, but I'm open to anyone else on the panel that would like to add something else.
Connie, there's a lot of questions in the chat. I just wonder if we run out of time, if maybe we can try to answer this in like a follow-up FAQ or something.
Yes, that would be a good. I can put these questions from the chat out to our panelists, and I can see if we can get the responses back out to the people who registered for the panel. Is that the question that you were asking? Yes. So we can try to do that. And I'm sorry that we didn't have more time for questions, but we certainly had a very interesting presentation from our expert panelists. And I appreciate your time and your expertise and your knowledge. And I think our key takeaways from today were that we need this disaggregated data and ways that we might be able to collect it and use that data to the advantage of increasing voter engagement, that education is a primary factor in getting people to participate in elections, having the proper knowledge behind them, accessibility for people to be able to vote. What kind of mechanisms can we put in place to ensure that people can vote when they're eligible to vote, and strengthening the electoral institutions so that we can have fair elections, that people respect the process, and hopefully that increases trust versus mistrust in our electoral processes. So thank you to all of our panelists today. You did a wonderful job, and I hope that our audience had some good takeaways from all of this. So thank you again for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks.
you.
Bye-bye.
Mhm.